The astonishing victory at Belgrade, a tale of courage and ingenuity. Dawn broke over the walls of Belgrade on July 4th, 1456, as 300 exhausted knights gazed out at what seemed to be their certain doom. Before them stretched the mighty Ottoman army, 40,000 strong, their thousands of tents dotting the Hungarian plain like stars in the night sky. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, had brought with him the largest cannons ever built, capable of hurling stone balls the size of cartwheels. The city's defenders knew they were witnessing the end of Christian Europe as they knew it. Or so they thought. What happened next would become one of history's most astonishing military upsets, a battle that would echo through the centuries and rewrite the rules of warfare. This is the story of how a desperate band of knights, led by a brilliant commander named John Hunyadi and inspired by a fiery Franciscan friar, would accomplish the impossible, turning the Ottoman Empire's most fearsome army into a fleeing mass of panic-stricken soldiers and saving Western civilization in the process. It's a tale that proves how human ingenuity, courage, and sheer audacity can transform the word impossible into inevitable. The rise of Sultan Mehmed II and the fall of Constantinople. Sultan Mehmed II stood atop the shattered walls of Constantinople, his silk robes billowing in the wind as he surveyed his greatest conquest. At just 21 years old, he had achieved what 14 centuries of Islamic rulers could not: the fall of Christianity's greatest city. The date was May 29, 1453, and as he walked through the blood-stained streets toward the desecrated Hagia Sophia, his mind was already turning to his next target, the Kingdom of Hungary. The young Sultan was a Renaissance man born into the wrong empire. He spoke 7 languages, studied classical philosophy, and could quote Aristotle at length, yet his true genius lay in the art of war. Under his command, the Ottoman army had been transformed into a terrifying modern force. His artillery corps, led by the brilliant Hungarian defector Urban, had created supernatural weapons. Cannons that could fire stone balls weighing up to 800 pounds, their thunderous reports heard from miles away. These monsters of bronze and iron had reduced Constantinople's legendary walls to rubble. Now they would be turned against the rest of Europe. News of Constantinople's fall sent tremors of terror through European capitals. Venice's merchants abandoned their trading posts. The Pope called for a crusade that no one would join. In Vienna, scribes documented refugees' tales of Ottoman atrocities, stories of impalement, mass executions, and enslaved Christians being marched east in chains. But perhaps nowhere was the fear more palpable than in Belgrade, the fortified city that stood as the last major obstacle between Mehmed's armies and the heart of Europe. Yet Mehmed's greatest advantage wasn't his cannons or his vast armies, it was Europe's disarray. The continent's powers were too busy fighting each other to unite against him. The Byzantine Empire was gone. Venice and Genoa squabbled over trading rights. The Hungarian nobles bickered about succession while their borders burned. And in Rome, Pope Calixtus III could only watch helplessly as his calls for unity fell on deaf ears. By the spring of 1456, Mehmed had assembled an army that seemed invincible. 40,000 men camped outside Edirne, elite janissaries with their matchlock muskets, Sipahi cavalry in gleaming armor, and bombardiers trained by the finest Italian and German gunners. Their supply train stretched for miles, a mobile city of tent makers, blacksmiths, doctors, and camp followers. This was no mere raiding force, it was an army built to conquer an empire. As Mehmed's forces began their march north toward Belgrade, few could have predicted that this seemingly unstoppable tide would crash against the most unlikely of breakwaters, an aging Hungarian nobleman and a zealous Italian monk. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of a continent, a battle so lopsided that its outcome would seem impossible, were it not etched into the bedrock of history itself. The last line of defense, Belgrade's stand against the Ottomans. Belgrade in 1456 was less a city than a fortress with streets. Its walls rose directly from the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, creating a natural moat on two sides. The Hungarians had spent a century turning it into what military architects called a perfect defense, a masterpiece of medieval engineering with double walls, overlapping fields of fire, and towers positioned precisely to rain arrows on any attacking force. But now those towers stood largely empty, their garrisons depleted by plague and desertion. Into this desperate situation rode John Hunyadi, his armor caked with the dust of a 100-mile journey. The defenders' faces lit up at the sight of him, not because of his title as Regent of Hungary, but because of his reputation. This was the man who had fought the Turks since he was 16, who had risen from minor nobility to become the shield of Christendom through sheer military genius. His weathered face bore a scar from a Turkish arrow, and his calculating eyes had seen more battles than most men had eaten hot meals. But even Hunyadi's arrival couldn't mask the brutal mathematics of the situation. Belgrade's garrison numbered barely 700 men. The walls, while strong, stretched for over 2 miles, too long for such a small force to defend effectively. Worse, the city's food supplies were dwindling, and the Ottoman fleet would soon control the rivers, cutting off any hope of reinforcement. As Hunyadi walked the battlements with his commanders, the weight of Europe's fate pressed down on his shoulders like a lead cloak. Salvation arrived in an unexpected form. John of Capistrano, a 69-year-old Franciscan friar, appeared at the city gates with an army that defied description. Behind him stretched a ragtag band of peasants, students, monks, and townspeople, armed with everything from hunting bows to farming tools. These weren't soldiers. They were ordinary people driven by Capistrano's extraordinary charisma and fiery sermons about holy war. The professional soldiers sneered, but Hunyadi saw something different in their eyes, the dangerous light of religious fervor. In the days that followed, Hunyadi and Capistrano formed an unlikely partnership that would reshape history. While the friar transformed his zealous volunteers into a fighting force through relentless drilling, Hunyadi focused on reorganizing Belgrade's defenses. He positioned his 300 knights, the only professional heavy cavalry at his disposal, in strategic reserves behind the walls. These men would become his scalpel in the coming battle, to be used at precisely the right moment to turn the tide. The defenders worked day and night, stockpiling arrows, reinforcing walls, and preparing fire weapons, medieval napalm made from sulfur, tar, and quicklime. Women and children joined the effort, gathering stones for catapults and boiling oil for the battlements. But time was running out. Ottoman scouts had already been spotted on the distant hills, and the summer air carried the faint sound of drums. The greatest army in the world was approaching, and Belgrade's defenders could only pray their preparations would be enough to withstand the coming storm. Against all odds, the siege of Belgrade. Hunyadi's first order upended centuries of military tradition. He commanded his knights to dismount and fight alongside the peasants. The nobles bristled. A knight's honor was tied to his horse, but Hunyadi's logic was ruthless. "Pride," he declared, "is a luxury we cannot afford." He knew that mounted cavalry would be useless in the cramped streets once the Turks breached the walls. Instead, he divided his professional warriors among the civilian militia, turning each knight into a battlefield commander who could steady the nerves of inexperienced fighters. Capistrano's training methods bordered on the revolutionary. Unable to teach complex military maneuvers to his civilian army in mere days, he instead crafted simple, almost choreographed responses to Turkish attacks. His followers practiced these moves with religious devotion: how to lock shields against cavalry charges, when to unleash volleys of arrows, and most importantly, how to maintain formation even when terrified. Fear, the old friar preached, is natural. Fleeing is a choice. The defenders' most audacious innovation came in their approach to siege warfare. Traditional doctrine called for passive defense, waiting behind walls while the enemy exhausted themselves. Hunyadi planned something different. He created small mobile units of 20 men each, mixed veterans with civilians, and drilled them in the art of nighttime raiding. These teams would slip out through hidden posterns, strike the Turkish camps, and vanish before retaliation could be mounted. It wasn't enough to survive the siege. Hunyadi intended to break it. Among the civilian volunteers, unlikely heroes emerged. A butcher named Mihaly proved to have an uncanny talent for artillery, able to judge distances and wind conditions with extraordinary accuracy. A group of charcoal burners became sappers, their experience with underground fires perfectly suited for collapsing enemy mining operations. Even the city's boatmen were transformed into an improvised navy, their small river craft modified with reinforced rams to challenge the massive Turkish galleys. As the last days of peace slipped away, Hunyadi gathered his commanders in Belgrade's Great Hall. The battle plan he unveiled was either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. The Turkish army would expect Belgrade's defenders to huddle behind their walls, hoping for rescue. Instead, Hunyadi planned to turn the siege into a series of running battles, using the city's fortifications not as a passive shield, but as a base for aggressive counterattacks. "They think they're hunting us," he told his assembled officers, "but we're about to become the hunters." In the pre-dawn hours of the final peaceful morning, 300 knights stood vigil in Belgrade's cathedral. They had removed their spurs, a symbolic gesture acknowledging that this battle would be fought on foot, and placed them on the altar. As dawn's first light filtered through the stained glass, these warriors sworn to chivalry prepared to fight alongside peasants in what would either be their finest hour or their last stand. Outside, the thunder of Ottoman drums grew closer. The siege of Belgrade, the Sultan's gambit. Mehmed's first move wasn't military, it was theatrical. He ordered his army to advance in total silence, 40,000 men moving like shadows across the Hungarian plain. Then, at a signal, they erupted into a cacophony of drums, horns, and war cries that made the ground itself tremble. Birds fled from the trees. Children in Belgrade wept. The psychological warfare had begun before a single arrow was loosed. The Sultan's artillery train arrived last, 22 siege cannons, each with its own name and crew. The largest, called the Empire's Fist, required 60 oxen to move. Its bronze barrel gleamed in the sunlight as Turkish engineers began the delicate process of positioning it. The gun's crew worked with the precision of surgeons, measuring powder charges and calculating trajectories. At sunrise the next day, Belgrade would face something no fortress in history had survived: a concentrated bombardment from the world's most powerful artillery park. Dawn brought hell. The first cannonball struck Belgrade's outer wall with such force that fragments of stone rained down 200 yards behind it. The impact created a sound unlike anything the defenders had ever heard, not just a boom, but a physical force that rattled teeth and blurred vision. 9 hours of continuous bombardment followed. Sections of the supposedly impregnable walls began to crack. Mehmed had found Belgrade's weakness. Its medieval fortifications had been designed to withstand catapults, not gunpowder weapons. But Hunyadi had prepared a response that the Turks never saw coming. As their gunners worked to adjust their aim, Serbian fishing boats slipped out from hidden coves along the riverbank. These vessels, weighted with stones and pitch, drifted seemingly harmless into the Ottoman artillery positions. When the morning sun hit them, observers on the walls counted 12 massive explosions. The Turks had been so focused on their cannons, they'd failed to notice the boat-borne bombs until they detonated in their midst. Mehmed's counter was immediate and brutal. He ordered his janissaries, elite infantry armed with early firearms, to establish firing positions overlooking the river. Any vessel attempting to leave Belgrade would face coordinated musket volleys. By sunset, the Danube's waters were stained red, and the defenders' boats remained trapped in their docks. The Sultan had sealed Belgrade into a cage of fire and lead. Night brought no respite. Turkish sappers began tunneling operations, while their artillery continued firing at random intervals, not to damage the walls, but to deny the defenders sleep. Inside Belgrade, Hunyadi ordered his men to rest in shifts, but the constant bombardment made real sleep impossible. As the first day of the siege ended, both sides recognized an uncomfortable truth. This battle would be won not by strength or numbers, but by whichever army could endure the longest while staying sane. Faith and Fury, the Battle of the Danube. Dawn on the Danube brought an impossible sight. 200 small boats had emerged from Belgrade's harbor, each packed with Capistrano's civilian volunteers. They came without armor, armed only with farm tools, axes, and an incandescent religious fervor. The friar himself stood in the lead vessel, his cross raised high. Against them waited the Ottoman fleet, 60 heavily armed galleys whose smallest ship outweighed the entire Christian flotilla combined. Hunyadi's plan hinged on physics and faith. The Hungarian commander had observed that the river's current, combined with a strong morning wind, would drive his lightweight vessels directly into the Turkish ships anchored across the Danube. His makeshift navy wouldn't need to outfight the Ottomans, they just needed to overwhelm them through speed and shock. Like a fist through a silk curtain, he told his boat captains. The battle began with a scene worthy of ancient legend. As Turkish arrows blackened the sky, Capistrano's voice rang out across the water, leading his followers in hymns. The Ottoman gunners, unnerved by their enemies' eerie singing, fired too early. Cannonballs meant to smash the Christian boats plunged harmlessly into the river. By the time they reloaded, Hunyadi's flotilla had closed the gap. What followed was unlike anything in naval warfare before or since. The Christian boats slammed into the Turkish ships with such force that many of the smaller vessels splintered on impact. But their crews, rather than drowning, used the wreckage as improvised bridges to swarm aboard the enemy galleys. Farmers who had never held a sword found themselves fighting hand-to-hand with professional Marines. The Danube's surface disappeared beneath a carpet of broken wood, thrashing bodies and blood. The Ottoman admiral, watching his carefully arranged fleet dissolve into chaos, ordered his remaining ships to break formation and engage individually. It was exactly what Hunyadi had hoped for. The moment the Turkish line fractured, he launched his masterstroke, a flotilla of fire ships, unmanned boats loaded with burning pitch that he'd hidden behind a river island. The current carried these floating infernos directly into the disorganized Ottoman fleet. By noon, the impossible had happened. The mighty Turkish fleet was in full retreat, leaving behind 20 burning galleys and thousands of dead. More importantly, Belgrade's supply lines were open again. As Christian reinforcements began crossing the river, Sultan Mehmed watched in cold fury from his command tent. His naval commanders knelt before him, expecting execution. Instead, the Sultan asked them a single question: how did farmers defeat my sailors? The answer lay in the strange alchemy that sometimes happens in war, when desperation and devotion combine to transform ordinary humans into something extraordinary. That night, as Turkish sailors pulled their dead from the river, they could still hear Capistrano leading prayers from Belgrade's walls. But now his voice carried a different weight. The Christian army had tasted victory, and with it came something even more dangerous than courage. They had begun to believe in miracles. The night that changed everything, Hunyadi's bold raid. Moonless nights were considered unlucky by medieval armies, but Hunyadi had been waiting for this one. As clouds blanketed the stars on July 21st, he gathered 2,000 men in Belgrade's underground crypts. Their armor was wrapped in cloth to prevent noise. Their faces were blackened with ash. Among them stood nobles who had never walked in darkness and peasants who had never held a sword, all united in what would either be a masterstroke or mass suicide. They emerged from hidden tunnels like ghosts, moving through no man's land in small groups. Turkish sentries, made complacent by their overwhelming numbers, had fallen into predictable patrol patterns. Hunyadi's scouts had spent days memorizing these routes, marking the blind spots with buried tokens. Now, they led their comrades through these invisible corridors, slipping between watchfires and past sleeping guards. The Ottoman artillery park was their target, specifically the massive powder magazines that fed the siege cannons. But Hunyadi's true objective was more subtle. He had noticed how the Turkish army arranged its camps in precise, organized circles around their heavy guns. The artillery wasn't just a weapon, it was the psychological anchor of their entire army. Break that anchor, he reasoned, and the whole Ottoman force might unravel. The raid's first victim was silence itself. At Hunyadi's signal, the night exploded into chaos. Christian raiders erupted from the darkness swinging spiked maces, weapons chosen because they were quieter than swords against armor. The Turkish artillery guards, many dozing at their posts, never had time to raise the alarm. Within minutes, the raiders had control of the massive siege guns. What followed was not destruction, but theft. Hunyadi's men had trained for weeks with wooden mock-ups, learning how to dismantle the Ottoman cannons with incredible speed. They worked like demons in the darkness, removing breach blocks, spiking touch holes, and sabotaging elevation mechanisms. The guns appeared intact, but come morning, they would be useless. More importantly, the raiders carried away the most critical pieces. Without them, the Sultan's prized artillery would become nothing more than expensive bronze tubes. Then everything went wrong. A Turkish cavalry patrol, returning early from a reconnaissance mission, stumbled upon the raid in progress. Alarm gongs shattered the night. Thousands of torches blazed to life. Hunyadi's careful plan dissolved into desperate improvisation. But here, the months of training paid off in unexpected ways. Instead of panicking, the Christian raiders split into their pre-assigned groups, each knowing exactly which direction to run. The Ottoman army awoke to find itself under attack from what seemed like all directions. Raids that had been discovered were transformed into feints. The night filled with shadow warriors who struck and vanished, drawing Turkish forces into confused pursuits that often ended with different Ottoman units colliding in the darkness. By the time the Sultan's commanders restored order, more than half of their artillery had been disabled, and their once orderly camp had become a maze of terrified soldiers jumping at shadows. Dawn revealed the raid's true impact. The Ottoman army, which had gone to sleep confident in its overwhelming strength, awoke to find its most potent weapons neutered. But the physical damage paled compared to the psychological blow. The myth of Turkish invincibility had been shattered. As the sun rose over Belgrade's walls, the entire strategic balance of the siege had shifted, though none yet realized just how completely. The Siege of Belgrade, a triumph of strategy over strength. Sultan Mehmed II made his fatal mistake at dawn. Enraged by the night's humiliation, he abandoned sophisticated siege tactics for brute force. "I want the walls breached by sunset," he commanded, sending his entire army surging toward Belgrade like a human tidal wave. The ground trembled under the feet of 40,000 warriors charging in unison. Even with their cannons disabled, the sheer mass of Ottoman forces seemed unstoppable. But Hunyadi had been counting on the Sultan's pride. The Hungarian commander had positioned his civilian militia on the walls with strict instructions: make a show of panic. The defenders fired arrows wildly, screamed in fear, and acted exactly as untrained peasants should. Several groups even fled their posts in apparent terror. The Sultan, watching from his command post, allowed himself a cold smile. Belgrade was finally breaking. The first Turkish troops reached the walls unopposed, raising scaling ladders by the hundreds. As they climbed, the Christian defenders continued their charade of disorganization until Hunyadi's herald blew a single piercing note on his horn. In that instant, the panic transformed into deadly choreography. Capistrano's supposedly untrained militia executed their carefully rehearsed responses with machine-like precision. Ladders were pushed back, boiling oil cascaded down, and hidden archer positions opened up devastating crossfire lanes. Still, Ottoman numbers told. They breached the outer wall in 3 places, and elite Janissary units poured through the gaps. But instead of finding terrified defenders, they encountered Hunyadi's dismounted knights waiting in the narrow streets. The close-quarter fighting was apocalyptic. Every alley became a bottleneck where Turkish numerical superiority meant nothing. The city's medieval layout, once considered a defensive weakness, transformed into a deadly maze where small units of defenders could hold off entire companies. Then Hunyadi unleashed his masterstroke. As the Ottoman army committed more forces to the breaches, he opened Belgrade's gates. The Sultan watched in disbelief as the defenders charged out to meet his army in open combat. It was madness, except that the Turkish forces had now been split in 2, caught between the sortie and the units already committed to the breach. More importantly, their rigid military hierarchy had been disrupted. Ottoman commanders, trained to fight as a unified force, now found their army fragmenting into isolated pockets. The battle reached its crescendo when Hunyadi himself led his 300 knights in a charge aimed directly at the Sultan's command post. Mehmed found himself facing a horrible choice: stand his ground and risk capture, or retreat and shatter his army's morale. He chose personal survival, withdrawing his elite guard just as Capistrano emerged on Belgrade's walls, leading the civilian militia in hymns that echoed across the battlefield. The Ottoman army's collapse, when it came, was total. Units that had been separated during the confused fighting began to retreat independently. Each withdrawal triggered others, as soldiers saw their comrades fleeing and joined them. Within hours, the mightiest army in Europe had dissolved into scattered bands of fugitives. Sultan Mehmed, watching his forces disintegrate, was struck by a fever that would plague him for months, though some chroniclers suggested it was shame rather than illness that burned in his blood. By sunset, the fields around Belgrade lay littered with abandoned Ottoman weapons, armor, and equipment. The Christian defenders, barely believing their victory, emerged from the city to find themselves masters of the largest military camp in Europe. Among the captured prizes was the Sultan's own war tent, a massive silk pavilion that would later be transformed into vestments for 100 priests, a fitting end for a battle where faith had proven stronger than steel. Victory and legacy. The Battle of Belgrade and its enduring impact. History pivots on small moments that echo through centuries. In the days following Belgrade's salvation, as Europe celebrated its deliverance, fate dealt a cruel twist. John Hunyadi, the architect of impossibility, fell ill while touring the captured Ottoman camp. The plague that had been festering in the summer heat claimed him within weeks. His last words, spoken to his son Matthias, were not about glory, but duty. Defend what we have saved. 3 months later, John of Capistrano followed his friend into death, their unlikely brotherhood sealed in eternity. The Sultan's response to his defeat revealed the battle's true magnitude. Mehmed, the conqueror who had never lost a major engagement, locked himself in his palace for 3 days. When he emerged, he had issued new orders. No Ottoman army would attempt to capture Belgrade for decades. He turned his empire's expansion eastward, claiming easier conquests in Asia. The psychological scar of watching history's most powerful army shatter against a fortress defended by farmers and priests would haunt him until his death. Europe changed in the victory's wake. The battle introduced gunpowder siege warfare to Western military thinking, but more importantly, it shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. Hunyadi's tactics, especially his integration of civilian militia with professional soldiers, revolutionized medieval warfare. Military historians would later mark Belgrade as the moment when the age of castle walls and knights began its slow transformation into modern combined arms warfare. The human cost was staggering. Over 10,000 Ottoman soldiers died in the siege, while Belgrade lost nearly a third of its defenders. But numbers alone cannot capture the battle's impact. The Ottoman Empire, which had seemed poised to swallow Europe whole, was forced to accept limits to its expansion. Belgrade would stand as a frontier between East and West for centuries, earning its title as the Shield of Christendom. Young Matthias Hunyadi honored his father's last command. He rose to become King of Hungary, transforming his father's defensive victory into the foundation of a golden age. Under his reign, Hungary would grow into a Renaissance power, its courts filled with scholars and artists. The Black Army he created, Europe's first standing professional military force, traced its tactical doctrine directly to Belgrade's civilian militia. Yet perhaps the battle's greatest legacy was invisible. In taverns and great halls across Europe, the story of Belgrade grew into legend, proof that the impossible was merely improbable, that faith and ingenuity could overcome overwhelming odds. Even Sultan Mehmed II, late in his life, reportedly told his sons, "Never underestimate your enemy's desperation. I once watched 300 knights and a priest's army destroy 40,000 of my finest troops." The bells that Pope Calixtus III ordered, rung in celebration of Belgrade's deliverance, still toll today, though few remember why. Every day at noon, across thousands of churches, they ring out in memory of a moment when the medieval world held its breath, and a handful of warriors proved that the word impossible is sometimes just a challenge waiting to be overcome. Echoes through time, lessons from the Siege of Belgrade. Modern military academies still study the Siege of Belgrade, though not for its medieval tactics or religious fervor. They study it for something far more fundamental: the psychology of asymmetric warfare. In an age of drone strikes and cyber attacks, the basic principle Hunyadi discovered still holds true: a smaller force can defeat a larger one by changing the rules of engagement. The US Naval War College uses Belgrade as a case study in how morale can become a weapon more powerful than any cannon. The battle's fingerprints appear in unexpected places. Urban warfare specialists analyzing the 21st century's most challenging military operations point to Hunyadi's use of Belgrade's narrow streets as a prototype for modern city defense. His integration of civilian volunteers into a professional military framework became a model for resistance movements across history, from the American Revolution to modern-day insurgencies. Silicon Valley, oddly enough, has embraced Belgrade's lesson about innovation under constraint. Tech startups facing entrenched corporate giants often cite the battle as a metaphor for disrupting larger competitors through unconventional thinking. One prominent venture capital firm even named its strategy for funding companies challenging industry leaders the Belgrade Doctrine. Yet perhaps the siege's most relevant lesson lies not in its tactics, but in its timing. Belgrade fell just 3 years after the invention of the printing press, and accounts of the victories spread across Europe with unprecedented speed. It became one of the first viral stories in history, demonstrating how information itself could become a force multiplier. The psychological impact of the Ottoman defeat traveled faster than any army could march. The physical landscape of the battle has changed beyond recognition. Modern Belgrade is a bustling metropolis where glass skyscrapers rise above the Danube. But beneath the city's streets, portions of the medieval walls still stand. Local guides show tourists the spots where Hunyadi's knights made their stands, where Capistrano's civilians turned farmers' tools into weapons, and where one of history's greatest empires learned that some fortresses can't be measured by the height of their walls. In the end, the Siege of Belgrade offers a timeless reminder. Victory often goes not to the side with the largest army or the most advanced weapons, but to those who dare to reimagine what's possible. In an era when the world again faces challenges that seem insurmountable, from climate change to cybersecurity, the echo of 300 knights facing down an empire still resonates. It whispers an eternal truth: the future belongs to those bold enough to reshape it.